Section 1 of The Democracy of the Constitution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. The Democracy of the Constitution and Other Addresses and Essays by Henry Cabot Lodge. The Public Opinion Bill, Part 1. The Public Opinion Bill. Footnote. Address before the Central Labor Union of Boston, September 15, 1907. The Public Opinion Bill which had been proposed was as follows. Public Opinion Bill as reported to the House of Representatives of Massachusetts at the last session of the legislature. An act to authorize the submission to voters, on official ballots at state elections, of questions of public policy. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives in general court assembled, and by the authority of the same as follows. Section 1. On a request signed by 1,000 voters asking for the submission of any question for an expression of opinion and stating the substance thereof, the Secretary of the Commonwealth shall transmit such request to the State Ballot Law Commission, who shall determine if such question is one of public policy, and if they so determine, shall draft it in such simple, unequivocal, and adequate form as they may deem best suited to secure a fair expression of opinion. Thereupon the Secretary shall prepare and furnish suitable forms, each to contain spaces for not more than 100 signatures, and if such forms shall be signed by 5,000 voters, he shall, upon the fulfillment of the requirements of this act, place such question on the official ballot to be used at the next state election. Forms shall bear the date on which they are issued, and no applications made on forms issued more than 12 months before the election concerned shall be received. Section 2. Signers of requests for the issuance of forms and signers of applications shall append to their signatures their residence, with street and number if any, and shall be certified as registered voters by the proper registrars of voters. One of the signers to each paper shall make oath of the genuineness of the signatures thereto, and a notary public, justice of the peace, or other magistrate, when taking such oath, shall satisfy himself that the person to whom the oath is administered is the person signing such paper, and shall so state in his attestation of such oath. All provisions of law relating to nomination papers shall apply to such requests and applications as far as may be consistent. Section 3. Applications shall be filed with the Secretary 60 days before the election at which the questions are to be submitted. Not more than 4 questions under this act shall be placed upon the ballot at one election, and they shall be submitted in the order in which the applications are filed. No question negatived and no question substantially the same shall be submitted again in less than 3 years. End of footnote. Mr. President and gentlemen, I am much indebted to you for your kindness in asking me to address you upon a public question which seems to me to be of the gravest importance. You are the representatives of the great labor organizations of Boston. But let me say at the outset that the measure which I am about to discuss is in no sense what is usually called a labor measure, any more than it is a party measure. It is one which affects the entire community, every man and woman alike, without regard to their occupation or position, for it involves a change not in our laws, but in the fundamental principles of our government. What I am about to say to you was prepared some months ago, before I left Washington, because I thought that I might desire to discuss this question after I had come home, and I wished to speak, whenever the opportunity occurred, with care and deliberation. This argument was not designed for a special audience, but for any audience of any kind that might care to listen to it, because it concerns equally all citizens of Massachusetts. I therefore do not address you merely in your capacity as representatives of our great labor organizations, but in your larger capacity as American citizens, interested above all in the welfare of the community and in the safety and permanence of the Republic. There was reported to the legislature during its last session an act known as the Public Opinion Bill. It was brought up in the House, and after a full and very able debate was defeated by a decisive majority. But although this bill and its purposes were well understood in the legislature, I do not think that the gravity of the measure and its far-reaching effect were fully appreciated by the people generally. As a matter of fact, no more fundamental and far-reaching measure has been presented to the legislature of Massachusetts within my recollection. It was not a mere change in legal practice, nor an alteration of long-established laws, nor even a constitutional change, which was proposed. The bill involved all these and much more, for if carried out logically to its full extent, it would mean nothing less than a complete revolution in the fabric of our government and in the fundamental principles upon which that government rests. This may seem an extreme statement, but I think it is susceptible of absolute demonstration, because this bill, if it should become law, would undermine and ultimately break down the representative principle in our political and governmental system. To make my meaning perfectly clear, it will be necessary to consider, briefly and historically, the principles upon which all government rests and the instruments by which it is carried on. Our division of the departments of government into executive, legislative, and judicial, with which we are entirely familiar, and which the Constitution of the United States made coordinate and independent, is not a new classification, but represents in whole or in part the recognized and essential foundations of all modern governments. The first method of government devised by man took the very natural form of a leader or chief. The recognition of a leader, indeed, may almost be described as a natural instinct, for leaders are common among herds of wild animals. The organization of government, therefore, by the recognition of a chief whose direction and command have greater or less authority, is found even among the most primitive races of man, except perhaps among a very few tribes in the lowest stages of development, who live in a condition of practical anarchy. The leader or chief of the savage tribe is the executive. He often, in the earliest times, combined with the executive power the religious function of high priest and the judicial function of deciding disputes among his followers. When we come to the great empires of which we have the earliest records, we find the executive fully developed, sacred in his person, and vested with authority which in effect made the government a despotism. All despotisms consist in the absorption of power by the executive, whether that executive is a single autocrat, as is usual, or a narrow oligarchy like the Council of Ten at Venice. The despot may or may not have ceased to exercise the judicial function personally, but if he has created judges, they exercise their powers only in his name. As for laws, he makes them all himself, and you can read today the laws of Babylon promulgated 6,000 years ago, and bearing the name of the king who made the code. In the supposed power of the king to cure disease by his touch, which was exercised in England by Queen Anne only 200 years ago, as well as in the theory of the divine right of kings and in the right of the subject to appeal to the king for redress, which have endured to our own times, you may witness the survival of the doctrines of the most ancient governments known, when all functions, religious, judicial, and legislative, were represented by the executive. Coming down from the most ancient times, we find in Greece and Rome a theory of government not known, so far as we are aware, to the more ancient Eastern monarchies. The governments of Greece, as a rule, and the government of Rome were founded on the principle that freeborn people of the city should govern themselves and choose their executive officers. In other words, we have there the idea of the New England town meeting. It would consume too much time for me to trace in detail the story of Greek and Roman government. The Greek cities were torn with factions, which led to the banishment of one party when the other was in power, to constant lapses into tyranny, and to complete inability to build up a strong, extensive, well-organized state. Even the genius of Alexander failed to create a Greek empire, and when he died, all that he had brought together under a single head fell to pieces. Rome started and went on for many centuries with the government of a city democracy, torn by the bloody strife of classes, and varied by relapses into oligarchies and dictatorships. The Romans had, in the highest degree, the genius of government as well as the genius for war. But nevertheless, when their dominions had become almost coextensive with the civilized world, government by the great senatorial families, tempered by the mob of the Roman Forum, went to pieces in corruption and disorder, and the earlier and simpler form of an all-powerful executive supervened. From the breakup of the Middle Ages, which succeeded the fall of the Roman Empire, gradually emerged the kingdoms of modern Europe. In every case but one, those kingdoms developed into autocracies, great or small. That single exception was England, and it is merely reiterating a truism to say that what saved England from becoming one of the despotisms which arose and flourished in Europe after the breakdown of the feudal system was her parliament. In that Parliament we find, for the first time, on a large scale, the representative principle. England did not have as pure a democracy, in theory or practice, as Greece or Rome, but both Greece and Rome lost their liberties, and England saved and extended hers. The rise of the modern despotisms of Europe after the beginning of the 16th century was marked by the gradual disappearance of those local representative bodies which had existed in the Middle Ages. The city republics of Italy, based on the theory of Rome and Athens, fluctuated between anarchy and tyranny until they all fell into the hands of domestic or foreign despots. Holland alone, of all the countries of Europe, preserved the freedom of her cities and her representative system, and it was Holland, a part of the empire of Charles V, which broke the power of Spain, and retaining the principle of representation, became under republican forms a free and powerful state. Wherever you look into the history of the last 400 years, you will find that the rise and the power of the representative body are coincident with liberty, and that the rise of despotism is coincident with the breakdown of whatever representative bodies there may have been. The history of the representative principle in modern times is the history of political freedom, and this representative principle is the great contribution of the English-speaking people and of the period since the Renaissance to the science of government. Without that principle, the democracy of Greece failed to build up a nation coextensive with the spread of Greek settlements and conquests, while that of Rome sank under a complete despotism. The empire of the first Napoleon, and of the third Napoleon as well, were both reared on the ruins of the legislative bodies of France. Examples might be multiplied, but nothing is clearer than that every lasting advance which has been made toward political freedom has been made by and through the representative principle. Even today, the struggle in Russia seeks, as its only assurance, the establishment of a representative body. Indeed, the movement for a larger political freedom, and for the right of the people to take part in their own government, which has filled Europe for the last century, is penetrating now to countries outside the pale of Western civilization, and the existence of this movement in Persia, in Turkey, and in China is manifested by the efforts in all those countries toward securing representative institutions. In a word, it may be said that the advance toward political liberty and the establishment of the rights of the people to govern have been coincident and gone hand in hand with the progress of the representative principle. It is also to be noted that the independence of the judiciary, the other great bulwark of liberty and of the rights of the individual, has followed everywhere upon the growth and success of the representative principle in government. The destruction of this principle, therefore, would mean reaction and the return to the system of an all-powerful executive. There could be no greater misfortune to free popular government than to weaken or impair the principle of representation, and the quickest way to break that principle down is to deprive the representative bodies of all responsibility and turn them into mere machines of record. You cannot take from your representative bodies all power of action and all responsibility and expect them to survive. If you bind a man's arm to his side and prevent its use and motion, the muscles weaken, the arm withers, and in time becomes atrophied and useless. If you force the legislature to deal with certain measures under a mandate which practically compels them to vote upon these measures in only one way, you take from your representatives all responsibility and all power of action, and the representative principle in your government will atrophy and wither away until it becomes, in the body politic, like some of those rudimentary organs in the natural body, quite useless and often a mere source of dangerous disease. This public opinion bill does this very thing, for it aims directly at the destruction of representative responsibility, and I think, although it received the support of many excellent people who did not pause to consider it carefully, that it found its origin among those small groups whose avowed purpose is to destroy our present institutions and forms of government and replace them with socialism or anarchy. The advocates of the bill continually raised the parrot cry that those who opposed it did not trust the people, and some persons were found who actually seemed to think that instructions from a town or other constituency, which were more common a century ago than they are today, were equivalent to a public opinion bill, and that there was some legal obstacle at the present time to such instructions. There is no relation or parallel whatever between instructions of this kind and the scheme proposed by this bill, nor is there anything to prevent instructions by a constituency, except the practical one caused by the increase in numbers of the electorate. The use of instructions has died out, although they are still employed occasionally, simply because improved means of communication and the growth of commercial, labor, and trade organizations have made other methods of reaching the same result quicker, easier, and more practicable. But this fact does not impair the rights of a constituency in the least, and any constituency can avail itself of this right if it so desires, for it is one of which no constituency could be deprived except by constitutional amendment. Every constituency, I repeat, has the right now, as always, to issue instructions to its representative if it can agree upon them, just as it has the right of petition. But that is a very different thing from the final determination by ballot of every possible abstract question by a popular vote. It is worthwhile to emphasize this difference, for it throws light upon the whole question. The constituency, in the first place, instructs only its own representatives. It does not undertake to instruct the representatives of other constituencies, but only its own, thereby recognizing the representative character of the member or senator or congressman whom it has chosen. The instructions, moreover, are passed by a meeting, where they can be discussed, amended, and modified, and where the arguments of both majority and minority can be heard. The constituency, in passing instructions, is not confined to a blind, categorical yes or no upon a question where neither amendment, discussion, nor modification is possible. They act themselves only with the same safeguards which have been thrown about the passage of laws in the legislature. They are not the helpless instrument of a plebiscite, but free men, setting forth their opinions in the manner which the history of free government has consecrated. Instructions from a constituency are the very antithesis of the mandate which it is proposed to extort or cajole from the people by such a scheme as this public opinion bill. As to the cry that those who opposed this bill showed by doing so that they did not trust the people, no more unfounded and misleading argument was ever uttered. Suppose I say to you that I do not think you can read in the dark. Do I thereby imply that your eyes are bad, or that I think you are ignorant and illiterate? Because I say that you cannot read in the dark, am I therefore to be accused of exhibiting distrust in your intelligence or your education? What I distrust and assail as a barrier to reading is the darkness. In order to read, you must have light. In order to make wise laws, you must have light to see whither you go, and not make wild plunges in the dark. For good laws, you must have good methods of lawmaking. I do not distrust the people who make the laws, but I distrust methods of lawmaking which would force good people to make bad laws. More than 300 of our Massachusetts communities govern themselves in town meeting. They are the purest democracies the world can show. They elect their executive officers by ballot. But all questions as to the policies and government of the town are submitted to the meeting on the warrant and are open to debate, to amendment, to reference to a committee, and to postponement. Do I distrust the people because I say that these questions ought to be submitted in precisely this way, and that this opportunity for debate, amendment, and postponement should be given, and that the voters should not be compelled to vote yes or no upon every question in the warrant without debate or delay? The people of our towns would never assent to such a change, or allow themselves to be deprived of full opportunity for debate, amendment, and postponement. And yet this is just what the public opinion bill proposes to inflict upon the people of the state at large. Here's another illustration of my meaning, drawn from the very principle which I seek to defend and preserve. I believe profoundly in representative government, but when I say that I am opposed to a single representative chamber, I am not showing distrust in representative government, but in a form of representative government which history and experience have proved to be fertile in evils. Let me, however, take an example, which exhibits my meaning and demonstrates my proposition better than anything else, from our administration of justice, at once the cornerstone and the bulwark of a free and well-ordered state. We determine differences between individuals, and we try men and women for crime by judges and juries. Is it to be argued that because we say that a man shall not be tried for his life by a mass meeting or popular vote, but by a judge and 12 jurymen under the forms and regulations of law, we do not trust the people? Has not experience shown that no man's rights or life would be safe unless there was secured to him, under the strongest guarantees, the right of trial by jury? The lynch law, against which all decent men protest, is often carried out by mass meetings frequently representing the passions and beliefs of an entire community. Is it a failure to trust the people because we insist that the legal rights of the people themselves cannot be preserved unless they are determined by a judge and jury? It is exactly the same in regard to legislation. Intelligent laws cannot be passed without consideration, debate, deliberation, and the opportunity for amendment. To answer yes or no on an abstract question is to legislate by ballot without any of the safeguards which representative government throws around the making of laws. Plebiscites of this sort have determined and fixed the power of autocratic emperors, but they have never made the laws of a free people. This public opinion bill is not even a referendum, for the referendum submits to popular approval a perfected measure, and in the case of purely local questions it is often used by our legislature. What is called the initiative is now covered, for all reasonable purposes, by the right of petition, but this public opinion bill puts both initiative and referendum into one act, and provides for the submission to the people, not of perfected law, but of any abstract question which any 1,000 people choose to suggest and which any 5,000 voters can be found to sign, and upon which the people have no opportunity to do more than vote categorically yes or no. You cannot hesitate, you cannot modify, you cannot amend, you cannot postpone. The pistol is at your head. Throw up your hands and answer yes or no at your peril. There are 4 questions on the ballot. Only one probably has been discussed, and that insufficiently, for perhaps 30 days. No matter, you must answer yes or no on all 4, and the legislature must, in reality, whatever theoretical liberty is supposed to retain, obey the mandate. There is to be no chance for reconsideration, no time for reflection, or for second thought. End of Section 1. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Section 2 of The Democracy of the Constitution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. The Democracy of the Constitution and Other Addresses and Essays by Henry Cabot Lodge. The Public Opinion Bill, Part 2. Those who supported this bill appeared to be under the pleasing delusion that no questions would find their way onto the ballot except those which made for the obvious improvement of society, or those which advanced their own particular interests. There could be no more mistaken belief. Under this bill, every sort of question would make its way onto the ballot. The only real condition is the 5,000 signatures, for 1,000 voters can suggest, and the duty of the officer who puts the question upon the ballot is purely ministerial, so that to obtain these 5,000 signatures would only mean the expenditure of a little time and a little money. The adroit and unscrupulous, with schemes for their own profit, or with devices to injure their opponents, would be much more likely to get questions placed upon the ballot than any one else. Propositions which, if adopted, might do infinite injustice to the great body of our working people, could easily be framed so as to appear quite harmless and catch the popular vote. Then, if adopted, the legislature would be bound under the mandate by the powerful instinct of self-preservation and the innate desire of shifting responsibility, if not by the terms of the statute itself, to embody them in the law. I have seen it asserted that this system would break the power of the boss and the lobbyist. On the contrary, it would give to those who make a business of politics and who seek legislation for their own profit an unrivaled opportunity, for they would be always prepared. They would have their 5,000 signatures always ready. They would shut out by dummy questions all others which they did not like, and place upon the ballot questions artfully drawn to serve their own purposes. Where organization, money, and perfect readiness are all that are required, the professional politician, with a personal or pecuniary interest at stake and untroubled by scruples, will defeat and outwit the amateur and outsider 9 times in 10. It is exactly because I trust the people, and desire that they should have every advantage, that I oppose such revolutionary legislation as this. To compel the people to legislate in a manner practically impossible for any very large body of voters is to do an injustice to the people themselves. It would be like compelling the people to decide by ballot upon the authority of what they happened to have read in the newspapers, or to have heard from their neighbors, whether a man was guilty of murder or not, and then find fault with them because they reached an erroneous decision. The people would not be to blame for the wrong decision, but those who forced upon them a method of trying a criminal case which in its very nature was utterly impossible in practice. Under this bill, the people are to be asked to legislate by saying yes or no to any question, no matter how abstract or how complicated, which any one can manage to have placed on the ballot. To deal with such questions by a categorical answer is absurd. It is the easiest thing in the world to frame a question to which a categorical yes or no is impossible. Take the familiar one, have you stopped beating your wife? Answer it yes or no, and see where it leaves you. Abstract questions can just as easily be framed to which a categorical yes or no would be utterly misleading, perilous, and unrepresentative. No people, no matter how intelligent, could legislate in such a way as this otherwise than disastrously. There would be no opportunity for modification or amendment, for repeated votes on different stages, or for debate. There would be but little chance for discussion, and good legislation without the opportunity for debate, amendment, and deliberate consideration is an impossibility. Less than 1% of the voters of the Commonwealth would have under this bill the power to force upon 99% of the voters any kind of question they chose to devise, and compel them to say yes or no to it. Thousands of voters, either through indifference or still more through lack of opportunity to understand the question, would refrain from voting, and an imperative mandate to the legislature might be carried by a small minority of the voters. Let me ask your attention to some figures in order to give you a vivid idea of what I mean, and to show how imperfectly yes and no votes, taken in this way, can be relied upon as reflections of the real will and true opinion of the people. These votes which follow were given upon constitutional amendments, the most serious questions which can be submitted, because they involve changes in our organic law, and were submitted with all the care and deliberation which the framers of our Constitution could provide. I ask you to consider those figures, for they demonstrate the utter falsity of the proposition that you can reach a true expression of the opinion of the people of Massachusetts by the methods proposed in this bill. In no one of these 10 instances did one half, in most of them nothing like a half, of the actual registered voters of the state cast their votes on the amendments thus submitted. Of those who went to the polls, in 3 cases, less than one half voted either way on the amendments. In one case, barely more than half voted, and in the remaining 6, more than a third to more than a quarter failed to vote either way. In no case was the amendment either carried or defeated, even by a majority of those who went to the polls, far less by a majority of the voters of the state, and yet this list includes the vote on biennial elections, which was debated and discussed everywhere for many weeks. Table: Popular votes upon articles of amendment to the Constitution of Massachusetts. On November 4, 1890, 2 amendments were voted on. First, change of residence in the state not to disqualify a voter for certain offices for 6 months. The amendment vote was 97,177 yes, 44,686 no, for a total of 141,863. 285,526 voted for the governor, which meant that 143,663 did not vote on the amendment. The second amendment, certain soldiers, etc., not disfranchised who have received aid from town or not paid a poll tax. The vote was 100,109 yes, 27,021 no, for a total of 127,130 votes. Again, 285,526 voted for the governor, which meant that 158,396 did not vote on the amendment. On November 3, 1891, 2 amendments were voted on. First, abolishing tax qualification for voters for governor, lieutenant governor, and members of the general court. 144,931 voted yes, 53,554 voted no, for a total of 198,485 votes on the amendment. 321,650 people voted for governor, which means that 123,165 did not vote for the amendment either way. Second amendment in 1891 was, a majority of each branch of the general court shall constitute a quorum. 152,688 votes for yes, 29,590 votes no, 182,278 total votes on the measure. Again, 321,650 votes for governor, which means that 139,372 people did not vote on that measure. On November 8, 1892, there was a question of abolishing the property qualification for office of governor. 141,321 voted yes, 68,045 voted no, for a total of 209,366. With 399,698 voting for governor, that means that 190,332 voters did not vote either way on the amendment. November 7, 1893, abolishing mileage to members of the General Court. 125,375 voted yes, 80,855 voted no, for a total of 206,230 votes on the measure. 365,012 people voted for governor, which means that 158,782 did not vote for the measure either way. On November 6, 1894, election of commissioners of insolvency abolished. 114,499 votes yes, 34,741 votes no, for a total of 149,240 votes on the measure, while 335,354 voted for governor, meaning that 186,114 people did not vote on the measure. November 3, 1896, biennial elections, treasurer's term of office limited to 3 years, 115,505 votes yes, 161,263 votes no, for a total of 276,768 votes on the measure, 385,064 votes for governor, meaning that 108,296 of the voters did not vote on the measure. Also in 1896, there was a vote biennial election of senators and representatives. 105,589 votes for, 156,211 votes against, for a total of 261,800 votes. Again, 385,064 voted for the governor, meaning that 113,264 voters did not vote on the measure. Finally, on November 5, 1907, authorizing the governor, with the consent of the council, to remove justices of the peace and notaries public. 178,005 votes in favor, 35,989 votes against, for a total of 213,994 votes. 373,695 votes for governor, so that 159,701 voters didn't vote on the measure. End of table. Let me take another example from a neighboring state, the state of Maine. Table. Vote upon constitutional amendments and laws submitted to the people of Maine. In 1875, they voted on the amendment, election of state senators by a plurality vote. 16,419 voted yes, 4,970 voted no, for a total of 21,389 votes on the measure. The vote for governor in that election was 111,665, meaning that 90,276 voters did not vote on the measure. Also in 1875, there was a vote on codification of an amended constitution. 17,841 votes yes, 3,104 votes no, for a total of 20,945 votes. Again, 111,665 voted for governor, so that 90,720 voters did not vote on the measure. In 1880, election of governor by plurality. Yes, 57,015, no, 35,402, for a total of 92,417 votes, 147,802 votes for governor, so that 55,385 voters did not vote on the measure. 1884, amendments to prohibitory laws. 70,789 votes yes, 23,811 votes no, for a total of 94,600 votes. 142,107 voted for governor, so that 47,507 voters did not vote on the measure. 1888, term of office of state treasurer. 12,947 yes, 10,249 no, for a total of 23,223 votes on the measure. 145,384 votes for governor means that 122,160 voters did not vote on the measure. 1892. There were two amendments on the ballot. First, whether adjutant general should be appointed or elected. Yes, 9,721. No, 9,509, for a total of 19,230 votes. 130,962 voted for governor, so that 111,732 voters did not vote on the measure. The second measure that year was educational qualification of voters. 25,775 votes yes, 18,061 votes no, for a total of 43,836. Again, 130,962 voted for governor, which means that 87,126 people did not vote on the measure. 1900. Whether office of state auditor should be created. 13,095 yes, 16,609 no, for a total of 29,704 votes on the measure. 117,878 voted for governor, meaning that 88,174 of the voters did not vote on the measure. 1904. Increasing compensation of members of the legislature. 11,047 votes yes, 18,061 votes no, 44,582 total votes on the measure. 131,512 voted for governor, meaning that 86,930 voters did not vote on the measure. End of table. Let us examine this table as we did that of Massachusetts. In only 2 cases out of 9 did more than half the voters who went to the polls vote upon the question submitted, and in each of those cases a third of those who went to the polls failed to vote on the submitted question, quite enough in each case to have reversed the result. In 5 of the remaining 7, less than a fifth of the voters who went to the polls, and in 2 only a quarter, voted on the submitted question. The people of Maine and Massachusetts are of a high average of intelligence. They are active, alert, and have been for generations accustomed to deal with every form of political questions. And yet these tables show that even on constitutional amendments submitted on the ballot, no expression could be obtained from a large majority of the voters, and, as a rule, not even from half of those who voted for governor and representative. It is apparent, in other words, that the people of these states do not like to govern themselves in this way, and that the very men who will vote for governor and representative will not vote on submitted questions because, as a rule, they do not feel that they have had opportunity to consider them and do not take a proper interest in them. Such a condition of things proves that to substitute legislation by ballot for legislation by representation is to cripple the rights of the people, and permit interested, fanatical, or corrupt factions, by superior organization and intensity of purpose, to dictate the laws of the entire community. These figures show the absolute truth of my assertion that questions submitted in this way are decided by a majority of a minority, and if this is true of constitutional amendments, fully and plainly stated, you can imagine what it would be on abstract questions, unknown, blind, uncomprehended, and incomprehensible. These figures demonstrate, beyond a peradventure, that no true public opinion can be obtained in this way, but that, on the contrary, this bill is a scheme to secure legislation which could not obtain the assent of the voters properly expressed through chosen and responsible representatives. It is a device to enable small and active minorities to obtain legislation which they could not secure by legitimate methods. Representatives represent the whole people. This bill would force upon us a government by a fraction of the people, and would defeat the will of the real majority of the people themselves. Yet the legislature would have no choice. They would be bound, in conscience and in practice, if not by the words of the statute, bound in a manner and forced by a pressure from which there would be no escape, to obey the mandate, no matter how obtained, and no man could tell in what form of law the mandate would be finally embodied. The chances are that the law under the pressure of the mandate would be the work of extremists and contrary to the wishes even of those who voted yes on the abstract proposition. There could be no greater travesty on popular government than a system which would permit a majority of a minority of the voters to force upon the state any law they chose. It would give an enormous opportunity to the power of money skillfully and corruptly used. It would impair the rights of the people, and leave those of the individual naked and defenseless. The result would not be an expression of the popular will, but a mechanical parody of that will, so gross that even its authors would gaze upon it with amazement and disgust. All these plans to make the people carry on their government by impracticable methods are not only unjust and dangerous to the people and to the public welfare, but they tend to bring all popular government into discredit. Do not misunderstand me. I attach no superstitious reverence to forms of government. I make no fetish of laws and constitutions, for constitutions are made for men, not men for constitutions. I have no patience with the theory held by some persons, and often pernicious in its activity, that human nature can be changed and all men made virtuous and happy by statute. People, according to my observation, get in the long run the government they desire and deserve, and if they suffer from bad government, it is because they are too inert, or too incapable, or too timid, or perhaps too corrupt to secure anything better. Government and the success of government in the last analysis depend upon the character of the people themselves. People with a high capacity for self-government will make a bad system work well, or at least tolerably well, while people without that capacity will come to confusion and ruin under the most ideally perfect system which the wit of man can devise. But while it is profoundly true that people make laws, not laws people, the importance and effect of laws, constitutions, and political institutions are none the less very great. The essential point is to comprehend in what that importance consists, and to gauge rightly the effect and educational force of laws and constitutions. In a word, to realize what laws can and what they cannot do. We must not forget that if statutes cannot change the laws of nature, it is equally a mistake to accept the quietist doctrine of Pope when he said in his familiar lines, quote, "For forms of government let fools contest, whate'er's best administered is best." Unquote. Allow me now to illustrate my meaning. Wise economic laws affecting the currency or the tariff cannot of themselves make prosperity. They can help very greatly to bring prosperity if a people be energetic and industrious and other conditions are favorable, but alone they cannot do it. On the other hand, bad economic laws, especially such as affect the circulating medium, can unaided and alone bring panic and disaster. To state this as a general proposition, we may say that while the effect of good economic laws for good is limited, the effect of bad economic laws for evil is unlimited. The power of economic statutes to injure is much greater than their power to benefit. This rule applies not only to all economic legislation, but to all laws. There is no panacea for human ills to be found in statutes. Statutes may help greatly. They may and do modify and alleviate and improve evil conditions. They may, according to the theory of Aristotle, direct the conduct of man to a moral result, but there their possibilities end, and many misfortunes have happened to mankind from the mistaken conception of the potentialities of statute making. On the other hand, the power of bad laws to bring on ruin, disaster, civil strife, and the downfall of governments and nations is practically unbounded. It is then of the last importance to consider carefully what the full effect of any law will be, and not to open the door for the sake of an apparent remedy for some special evil to 1,000 worse evils which might involve all in a common disaster. Therefore laws not only assume a vast importance, but also the methods and instrumentalities by which they are made. Good laws are not to be expected, if you impose conditions upon their making incompatible with good results. The best glazier in the world cannot cut a square of glass if you insist that he shall do it with a broadaxe or a pointed stick. Under such conditions he would merely smash the glass, and you and not he would be to blame. You must give him a diamond point, and you will get your window pane. You can impose conditions upon a people under which it will be impossible for them to secure good legislation, and it will not be any reflection upon them or their capacity for self-government if they bring forth laws which work ruin and disaster as widespread as they are needless. It shows no more distrust to insist that the people shall use wise and well-tried methods of legislation to obtain the laws they desire, than it shows distrust of the glazier to insist that he shall use a proper tool to cut his square of glass. I have heard it asked, whether those who opposed this bill thought that the American people had ever decided a great question wrongly. My answer would be no, so far as concerns all the greatest questions of our history which have been decided by the people, on full consideration and under the conditions prescribed by our constitutions and laws. The Revolution, the adoption of the Constitution, the preservation of the Union, the abolition of slavery, the integrity of the public debt, the maintenance of the gold standard, all these great questions were decided by the people rightly and nobly, but only after years of discussion and under the conditions of representative government. If, on the other hand, you ask me if the popular decision in a moment of excitement and clamor, with no opportunities for deliberate discussion, has always been right, I answer no. And I will give you an example from the history of this state. A little more than 50 years ago there was a movement here called the Native American or Know Nothing movement. It was carried on by secret, oath-bound organizations. They not only swept the state and crushed Whigs and Democrats out of existence, but they actually elected all but 2 of the members of the legislature. If they had not been restrained by the Constitution and by the laws and the methods of representative government, they would have excluded from citizenship every man of foreign birth or of a different religion from their own. If they had been acting under a popular mandate, which would have been easily obtained in that year, to the effect that only citizens of American birth and of the Protestant faith should be entitled to citizenship, that constitutional change would have been made. But as there was no public opinion law, the legislature were only bound to the general principles of their party. They were not deprived of motion and sense of responsibility by a mandate. They were open, even with all their power, to the effect of public opinion expressed by a strong minority outside, and they had time for reflection and for cooling down. Thus, by the forms of representative government and by the absence of anything resembling the mandate for which the public opinion bill provides, they were held back from the violent extremes which the passions flagrant at the election would have demanded and enforced. I think it was very fortunate that they were so restrained, because the decision of the people at the polls in that year of passion and excitement was, in my opinion, utterly wrong, when tried by the true principles of free American government. In a few years everyone else thought so too, after the madness had passed. You say such things could not happen today. I hope not, but human passions have not changed, and in moments of excitement men are capable of acts which, on reflection, they would not entertain for a moment. It is to secure ample opportunity for deliberation and reflection that representative government exists, and it is inconceivably precious not only to the individual man whose rights are at stake, but to the wider interests of the whole community. I trust the people fully. I believe what the authors of the bill deny, that they are able to choose their own representatives and to control them. I do not think the people are so weak or so stupid that they cannot choose men who will fitly represent them, and that they cannot reject their representatives if those representatives do not perform their duties. I think the people are eminently capable of governing themselves by proper methods, and that their power should not be distorted and crippled by impossible devices. But the great and fundamental objection to this bill is the destruction of the representative principle which it necessarily involves. When that is broken down, nothing remains but the executive and the courts. With the representatives deprived of power, the courts would not long retain their independence, and when the executive department alone survives, we are well on the road to despotism. The resort to the plebiscite is a favorite device of the usurper and savior of society. His opportunity comes when disorder, license, and wild legislation have driven the mass of men to a readiness to sacrifice liberty in the determination to have peace and order, a sad and desperate situation, familiar, unhappily, in the world's history. Moreover, the advent of the strong man and the army is always coincident with the breaking down of representative government. What we want, above all things, is to preserve the representative bodies which have ever been the guardians of freedom and of popular liberties in this country. I trust the people so thoroughly that I believe they can conduct their government with honor and success, as they have done for so many generations. Times change, and conditions change with them. We must meet the new times and the changing conditions with the legislation which they demand, but in dealing with our new problems it is not necessary to cast away the instrument by which every reform and every improvement have hitherto been effected. I am not one of those who believe that all wisdom died with our forefathers. I am equally far from believing that all wisdom was born yesterday. This is not a new question, but involves the oldest theories of government, and here, if anywhere, history and experience are safe and illuminating guides which only ignorance and folly would neglect or disregard. The great men who framed our Constitution provided both in state and nation for checks and balances, because they believed that the rights of the people could only be protected if every possible safeguard was thrown around the lawmaking power. They believed that that power ought only to be exercised with the utmost care and deliberation, and in seeking that care and deliberation they believed that they were protecting the rights of the people. They saw in hasty legislation great perils, and they never had the slightest fear that the legislative body would not respond quickly enough to the popular wishes. They had a great dread of executive power, and a deep desire to protect the rights of minorities. The majority, they believed, ought to rule, but they wished to be very sure that majority rule should not be rashly or hastily exercised. They wished the members of a majority to remember that they might find themselves any day in a minority, and therefore they took the utmost pains to secure every opportunity in legislation for debate and amendment. "They wished men to be free, as much from mobs and kings, from you as me." Unquote. Experience has shown us the justice of their opinions. This bill invites us to cast aside all that they did, break down every method of lawmaking which they established, and reject that principle which they most valued, the principle of representation. I say reject the principle of representation because when you impair it, and take from your representatives all power and all responsibility, the principle of representation fails. No men invested with the power to make laws, but relieved of all responsibility for the laws they make, are to be trusted. We may change many things. We may abolish laws and put new ones in their place, but we cannot alter the fundamental principles of our government and expect the fabric to stand. If we undermine and overthrow the bulwarks of ordered liberty and individual freedom, the citadel itself will not long survive. Any measure which breaks down free representative government advances us proportionately on the road to executive government, to the rule of one man. This public opinion bill will reduce the representative on one question after another to the level of a machine. As the representative principle sinks, the executive power rises. I believe in maintaining both and maiming neither. I am opposed to crippling and extinguishing representative government. I love freedom and hate tyranny, and anything which depresses the one and opens the road to the other will meet with resistance from me. It is for this reason that I oppose this bill. End of Section 2. Recording by Colleen McMahon.
Section 3 of the Democracy of the Constitution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Facio. The Democracy of the Constitution and Other Addresses and Essays by Henry Cabot Lodge. The Constitution and Its Makers, Part 1. Before this society, and on such an occasion, to speak on any topic not connected with the history of our common country would hardly be possible and would certainly not be fitting. I have, therefore, chosen a subject which touches the history of the United States at every point. I shall try to set before you some of the results of a great work in which your state and mine alike took part a century and a quarter ago, and which possesses an interest and an importance as deep and as living today as at the moment of its inception. I shall touch upon some present questions, but I shall speak without the remotest reference to politics or parties, for my subject transcends both. I shall speak as a student of our history, with reverence for the past and with a profound faith in the future. In a word, I shall speak simply as an American who loves his country now and forever, one and inseparable. A little less than 25 years ago, great crowds thronged the streets of Philadelphia. Men and women were there from all parts of the United States. The city was resplendent with waving flags and brilliant with all the decorations which ingenuity could suggest, while the nights were made bright by illuminations which shone on every building. Great processions passed along the streets, headed by troops from the 13 original states, marching in unusual order, with Delaware at the head, because that little state had been the first to accept the great instrument of government which now, having attained its 100th year, was celebrated in the city of its birth. Behind the famous hall where independence was declared, an immense crowd listened to commemorative speakers, and the President of the United States, a Democrat, honored the occasion with his presence and his words. 2 years later, in 1889, the same scenes were repeated in New York. Again the cannon thundered, and again flags waved above the heads of the multitude gathered in the streets, through which marched a long procession, both military and civil, headed as before by the representatives of the original 13 states. Again, at a great banquet, addresses were delivered, and once more the President of the United States, this time a Republican, honored the occasion by his presence, and in the name of all the people of the country praised the work of our ancestors. In Philadelphia, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the formation of the Constitution of the United States. In New York, we commemorated the 100th anniversary of the inauguration of the government which that Constitution had brought into being. Through all the rejoicings of those days, in every spoken and in every written word, ran one unbroken strain of praise for the great instrument and of gratitude to the men who, in the exercise of the highest wisdom, had framed it and brought it forth. All men recalled that it had made a nation from that 13 jarring states, that it had proved in its interpretation flexible to meet new conditions and strong to withstand injustice and wrong, that it had survived the shock of civil war, and that under it liberty had been protected and order maintained. The paean of praise rose up from all parts of this broad land unmarred by a discordant note. Everyone agreed with Gladstone's famous declaration that the Constitution of the United States was the greatest political instrument ever struck off on a single occasion by the minds of men. We seemed indeed by all we then said and did to justify those foreign critics who reproached us with our kind reverence for our Constitution and our almost superstitious belief in its absolute wisdom and unexampled perfections. Those celebrations of the framing of the Constitution and of the inauguration of the government have been almost forgotten. More than 20 years have come and gone since the cheers of the crowds which then filled the streets of New York and Philadelphia, since the reverberations of the cannon and the eloquent voices of the orators died away into silence. And with those years, not very many after all, a change seems to have come in the spirit which at that time pervaded the American people from the President down to the humblest citizen in the land. Instead of the universal chorus of praise and gratitude to the framers of the Constitution, the air is now rent with harsh voices of criticism and attack. While the vast mass of the American people, still believing in their Constitution and their government, look on and listen, bewildered and confused, dumb thus far from mere surprise, and deafened by the discordant outcry so suddenly raised against that which they have always reverenced and held in honor. Many excellent persons believe apparently that beneficent results can be attained by certain proposed alterations in the Constitution, often, I venture to think, without examination of the history and theory of government, and without measuring the extent or weighing the meaning of the changes which are urged upon us. But it is also true that every one who is in distress, or in debt, or discontented, now assails the Constitution, merely because such is the present passion. Every reformer of other people's misdeeds, all of that numerous class which is ever seeking to promote virtue at somebody else's expense, pause in their labors to point out the supposed shortcomings of our national charter. Every raw demagogue, every noisy agitator, incapable of connected thought and seeking his own advancement by the easy method of appealing to envy, malice, and all uncharitableness, those unlovely qualities in human nature which so readily seek for gratification under the mask of high-sounding and noble attributes. All such people now lift their hands to tear down or remake the Constitution. In House and Senate one can hear attacks upon it at any time and listen to men deriding its framers and their work. No longer are we criticized by outsiders for having a superstitious reverence for our Constitution. Quite recently I read an article by an English member of Parliament, Mr. L.T. Hobhouse, a Liberal, I believe, with socialist proclivities, who said that this reproach of an undue veneration for the Constitution ought no longer be brought against us, because beneficent and progressive spirits were already beginning to pull it to pieces and were seeking to modernize it in conformity with the clamor of the moment. All this is quite new in our history. We have as a people deeply reverenced our Constitution. We have realized what it has accomplished and what protection it has given to ordered freedom and individual liberty. Even the abolitionists, when they denounced the Constitution for the shelter which it afforded to slavery, did not deny its success in other directions, and their hostility to the Constitution was one of the most deadly weapons used against them. The enmity to the Constitution and the attacks upon it which have developed in the last few years present a situation of the utmost gravity. If allowed to continue without answer, they may mislead public opinion and produce the most baneful results. The people of the United States may come to believe that all these attacks, in a measure, at least, are true. Therefore, if they are not true, their falsity ought to be shown. Beside the question of the maintenance or destruction of the Constitution of the United States, all other questions of law and politics sink into utter insignificance. In its presence, party lines should disappear, and all sectional differences melt away like the early mists of dawn before the rising sun. The Constitution is our fundamental law. Upon its provisions rests the entire fabric of our institutions. It is the oldest of written constitutions. It has served as a model for many nations, both in the Old World and in the New. It has disappointed the expectations of those who opposed it, convinced those who doubted, and won a success beyond the most glowing hopes of those who put faith in it. Such a work is not to be lightly cast down or set aside, or, which would be still worse, remade by crude thinkers and by men who live only to serve and flatter in their own interest the emotion of the moment. We should approach the great subject as our ancestors approached it, simply as Americans with a deep sense of its seriousness, and with a clear determination to deal with it only upon full knowledge and after the most mature and calm reflection. The time has come to do this, not only here and now, but everywhere throughout the country. Let us first consider who the men were who made the Constitution, and under what conditions they worked. Then, let us determine exactly what they meant to do, a most vital point, for much of the discussion to which we have been treated thus far has proceeded upon a complete misapprehension of the purpose and intent of the framers of the Constitution. Finally, let us bring their work and their purposes to the bar of judgment, so that we may decide whether they have failed, whether in their theory of government they were right or wrong then and now, or whether their work has stood the test of time, is broad based on eternal principles of justice, and, if rent or mangled or destroyed, would not in its ruin bring disaster and woes inestimable upon the people who shall wreck their great inheritance. And like the base Indian throw a pearl away richer than all his tribe. First, then, of the men who met in Philadelphia in May 1787, with doubts and fears oppressing them, but with calm, high courage, and with a noble aspiration to save their country from the miseries which threatened it, to lead it out from the wilderness of distractions in which it was wandering blind and helpless, into the light, so that the chaos, hateful alike to God and man, might be ended, and order put in its place. It is the fashion just now to speak of the framers of the Constitution as worthy, able, and patriotic persons, whom we are proud to have embalmed in our history, but toward whom no enlightened man would now think of turning seriously for either guidance or instruction. So thoroughly has everything been altered, and so much has intelligence advanced. It is commonly said that they dealt wisely and well with the problems of their day, but that of course they knew nothing of those which confront us, and that it would be worse than folly to be in any degree governed by the opinions of men who lived under such wholly different conditions. It seems to me that this view leaves something to be desired, and is not wholly correct or complete. I certainly do not think that all wisdom died with our fathers, but I am quite sure that it was not born yesterday. I fully realize that in saying even this I show myself to be what is called old-fashioned, and I know that a study of history, which has been one of the pursuits of my life, tends to make a man give more weight to the teachings of the past than they are now thought to deserve. Yet, after all allowance is made, I cannot but feel that there is something to be learned from the men who established the government of the United States, and that their opinions, the result of much and deep reflection, are not without value, even to the wisest among us. On questions of this character, I think, their ideas and conclusions are not lightly to be put aside, for, after all, however much we may now gently patronize them as good old patriots long since laid in their honored graves, they were none the less very remarkable men, who would have been eminent in any period of history, and might even, if alive now, attain to distinction. Let us glance over the list of delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. I find, to begin with, that their average age was 43, which is not an extreme senectitude, and the ages range from Franklin, who was 81, to John Francis Mercer of Virginia, who was 28. Among the older men who were conspicuous in the convention were Franklin, with his more than 80 years, Washington, who was 55, Roger Sherman, who was 66, and Mason and Wythe of Virginia, who were both 61. But when I looked to see who were the most active forces in that convention, I found that the New Jersey plan was brought forward by William Paterson, who was 42, that the Virginia plan was proposed by Edmund Randolph, who was 34, while Charles Pinckney, of South Carolina, whose plan played a large part in the making of the Constitution, was only 29. The greatest single argument, perhaps, which was made in the convention was that of Hamilton, who was 30. The man who contributed more possibly than any other to the daily labors of the convention, and who followed every detail, was Madison, who was 36. The Connecticut Compromise was very largely the work of Ellsworth, who was 42, and the Committee on Style, which made the final draft, was headed by Gouverneur Morris, who was 35. Let us note, then, at the outset that youth and energy, abounding hope, and the sympathy for the new times stretching forward into the great and uncharted future, as well as high ability, were conspicuous among the men who framed the Constitution of the United States. Their presiding officer was Washington, one of the great men of all time, who had led the country through 7 years of war, and of whom it has been said by an English historian that no nobler figure ever stood in the forefront of a nation's life. Next comes Franklin, the great man of science, the great diplomatist, the great statesman and politician, the great writer, one of the most brilliant intellects of the 18th century, who in his long life had known cities and men as few others have ever known them. There was Hamilton, one of the greatest constructive minds that modern statesmanship has to show, to whose writings German statesmen turned when they were forming their empire 40 years ago, and about whom in these later days books are written in England, because Englishmen find in the principal author of the Federalist the great exponent of the doctrines of successful federation. There, too, was Madison, statesman and lawmaker, wise, astute, careful, destined to be, under the government which he was helping to make, Secretary of State and President. Roger Sherman was there, sagacious, able, experienced, one of the leaders of the Revolution and a signer of the Declaration of Independence, as he was of the Constitution. Trained and eminent lawyers were present in Philadelphia in that memorable summer of 1787, such men as Ellsworth and Wilson and Mason and Wythe. It was, in a word, a very remarkable body which assembled to frame a constitution for the United States. Its members were men of the world, men of affairs, soldiers, lawyers, statesmen, diplomatists, versed in history, widely accomplished, deeply familiar with human nature. I think that without an undue or slavish reverence for the past, or for the men of a former generation, we may fairly say that in patriotism and in intellect, in knowledge, experience, and calmness of judgment, these framers of the Constitution compare not unfavorably with those prophets and thinkers of today who decry the work of 1787, who seek to make it over with all modern improvements, and who with unconscious humor declare that they are engaged in the restoration of popular government. That phrase is in itself suggestive. That which has never existed cannot be restored. If popular government is to be restored in the United States, it must have prevailed under the Constitution as it is, and yet those who, just now, are so devoured by anxiety for the rights of the people, propose to effect the restoration they demand by changing the very constitution under which popular government is admitted by their own words to have existed. I will point out presently the origin of this confusion of thought. It is enough to say now that for more than a century no one questioned that the government of the Constitution was in the fullest sense a popular government. In 1863 Lincoln, in one of the greatest speeches ever uttered by man, declared that he was engaged in trying to save government by the people. Nearly 30 years later, when we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Constitution, the universal opinion was still the same. All men then agreed that the government which had passed through the fires of civil war was a popular government. Indeed, this novel idea of the loss of popular government, which it is proposed to restore by mangling the Constitution under which it has existed for more than a century, is very new, in fact hardly 10 years old. This first conception of our Constitution as an instrument of popular government, so long held unquestioned, was derived from the framers of the Constitution themselves. They knew perfectly well that they were founding a government which was to be popular in the broadest sense. The theory now sedulously propagated that these great men did not know what they were about, or were pretending to do one thing while they really did another, is one of the most fantastic delusions with which agitators have ever attempted to mislead or perplex the public mind. The makers of the Constitution may have been right, or they may have been wrong in the principles upon which they acted, or in the work they accomplished, but they knew precisely what they meant to do, and why they did it. No man in history ever faced facts with a clearer gaze than George Washington, and when, after the adjournment of the convention, he said, "We have raised a standard to which the good and wise can repair. The event is in the hands of God," he labored under no misapprehension as to the character of the great instrument where his name led all the rest. It is the fashion to say that since then great changes have occurred, and wholly new conditions have arisen, of which the men of 1787 could by no possibility have had any knowledge or anticipation. This is quite true. They could not have foreseen the application of steam to transportation, or of electricity to communication, which have wrought greater changes in human environment than anything which has happened to man since those dim, prehistoric, unrecorded days when someone discovered the control of fire, invented the wheel, and devised the signs for language, masterpieces of intelligence with which even the marvels of the last century cannot stand comparison. The men of the Constitution could as little have foreseen what the effects of steam and electricity would be as they could have anticipated the social and economic effects of these great inventions, or the rapid seizure of the resources of nature through the advances of science and the vast fortunes and combinations of capital which have thus been engendered. Could they, however, with prophetic gaze have beheld in a mirror of the future all these new forces at work, so powerful as to affect the very environment of human life, even then they would not, I think, have altered materially the Constitution which they were slowly and painfully perfecting. They would have kept on their way, because they would have seen plainly what is now too often overlooked and misunderstood, that all the perplexing and difficult problems born of these inventions, and of the changes, both social and economic, which have followed were subjects to be dealt with by laws, as the questions arose, and laws and policies were not their business. They were not making laws to regulate or to affect either social or economic conditions. Their work was not only higher, but far different. They were laying down certain great principles upon which a government was to be built, and by which laws and policies were to be tested as gold is tested by a touchstone. Upon the work in which they were engaged, social and economic changes or alterations in international relations and political conditions, no matter how profound or unforeseen, and none could have been more profound or unforeseen than those which have actually taken place, had little bearing or effect. They were framing a government, and human nature was the one great and controlling element in their problem. Human nature, with its strength and its weakness, its passions and emotions so often dominating its reason, its selfish desires and its nobler aspirations, was the same then as now. There is no factor so constant in human affairs as human nature itself, and in its essential attributes it is the same today as it was among the builders of the pyramids. As to the principles of government which the framers of the Constitution wished to adapt to that portion of human nature which had gained a foothold on the North American continent, there was little to be discovered. There is no greater fallacy than to suppose that new and fundamental principles of government are constantly to be invented and wrought out. Laws change and must change with the march of humanity across the centuries as it alteration finds in the conditions about it. But fundamental principles and theories of government are all extremely old. The very words in which we must express ourselves when we speak of forms of government are all ancient. Let me recall a few facts which every schoolboy knows, and which any one can obtain by indulging in that too much neglected exercise of examining a dictionary. Anarchy, for example, is the Greek word rule, or command, with the alpha privative in the form of "an" prefixed, and means the state of a people without government. Monarchy is the rule of one. Oligarchy is the rule of a few. We cannot state what our own government is without using the word democracy, which is merely the Greek word demokratos, and means popular government, or the rule of the people. Aristocracy, ideally as Aristotle had it, is the rule of the best. But even in those days it meant in practice the rule of the best born, or nobles. Plutocracy is the rule of the rich. Autocracy, self-derived power, the unlimited authority of a single person. Ochlocracy is the rule of the multitude, for which we have tried to substitute the hideous compound mobocracy. As with the words, so with the things of which the words are the symbol. The people who invented the one had already devised the other. The words all carry us back to Greece, and all these various forms of government were well known to the Greeks, and had been analyzed and discussed by them with a brilliancy, a keenness, and an intellectual power which have never been surpassed. If you will read the Republic and the Laws of Plato, and supplement that study by an equally careful examination of what Aristotle has to say on government, you will find that those great minds have not only influenced human thought from that time to this, but that there is little which they have left unsaid. It is the fashion, for example, to speak of socialism as if it were something new, a radiant discovery of our own time which is to wipe away all tears. The truth is that it is very old, as old in essence as human nature, for it appeals to the strong desire in every man to get something for nothing, and to have someone else bear his burdens and do his work for him. As a system, it is amply discussed by Plato, who, in the Republic, urges measures which go to great extremes in this direction. In the 4th century of our era, a faction called the Circumcellens were active as socialists, and caused great trouble within the weakening Empire of Rome. The real difficulty historically with the theories of socialism is not that they are new, but that they are very, very old, and wherever they have been put in practical operation on a large scale, they have resulted in disorder, retrogression, and in the arrest of civilization and progress. Broadly stated, there have been only two marked additions to theories or principles of government since the days of the Greeks and the Romans. One is the representative principle developed by the people of England in the Mother of Parliaments, and now spread all over the world, and the other is the system of federation on a large scale, embracing under a central government of defined powers a union of sovereign and self-governing states, which the world owes in its bold and broad application to the men who met at Philadelphia to frame our Constitution in 1787. With these exceptions, the framers of the Constitution dealt with the theories and systems of government which have been considered, discussed, and experimented with for more than 2,000 years, and which are today, a century later, the same as in 1787, unchanged, and with no additions to their number. In order to reach the essence of what the makers of the Constitution tried and meant to do, which it is most important to know and reflect upon deeply before we seek to undo their work, let us begin by dismissing from our consideration all that is unessential or misleading. Let us lay aside first the word republic, for a republic denotes a form and not a principle. A republic may be democratic like ours, or an autocracy like that of Augustus Caesar, or an oligarchy like Venice, or a changing tyranny like some of those visible in South America. The word has become as inaccurate, scientifically speaking, as the word monarchy, which may be in reality a democracy as in England or Norway, constitutional as in Italy, or a pure despotism as, until very lately, in Russia. Let us adhere in this discussion to the scientifically exact word, democracy. Next, let us dismiss all that concerns the relations of the states to the national government. Federation, as I have said, was a single contribution of the Philadelphia Convention to the science of government. The framers of the Constitution, if they did not invent the principle, applied it on such a scale and in such a way that it was practically a discovery, a venture both bold and new, as masterly as it was profoundly planned. With the love of precedence characteristic of their race, they labored to find authority and example in such remote and alien arrangements as the Achaean League and the Amphictyonic Council. But the failure of these precedents as such was the best evidence of the novelty and magnitude of their own design. Their work in this respect has passed through the ordeal of a great war. It has been, and is today, the subject of admiration and study on the part of foreign nations, and not even the most ardent reformer of this year of grace would think, in his efforts to restore popular government, of assailing the union of sovereign states. Therefore, we may pass by this great theme which was the heaviest part of the task of our ancestors. In the same way we may dismiss, much as it troubled the men of 1787, all that relates to the machinery of government, such as the electoral college, the tenure of office, the methods of electing senators and representatives, and the like. These matters are important. Many active thinkers in public life seek to change them, not for the better, as I believe, but none the less these provisions concern only the mechanism of government. They do not go to the root of the matter. They do not affect the fundamental principles upon which the government rests. End of section 3. Section 4 of the Democracy of the Constitution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Fazio. The Democracy of the Constitution and Other Addresses and Essays by Henry Cabot Lodge. The Constitution and its Makers, Part 2. By making these omissions we come now to the vital point, which is, what kind of a government did the makers of the Constitution intend to establish, and how did they mean to have it work? They were, it must be remembered, preparing a scheme of government for a people peculiarly fitted to make any system of free institutions work well. The people of the United Colonies were homogeneous. They came in the main from Great Britain and Ireland, with the addition of the Dutch in New York, of some Germans from the Palatinate, and of a few French Huguenots, whose ability and character were as high as their numbers were relatively small. But an overwhelming majority of the American people, in 1787, were of English and Scotch descent, and they, as well as the others from other lands, were deeply imbued with all those principles of law which were the bulwarks of English liberty. In this new land, men had governed themselves, and there was at that moment no people on earth so fit for or so experienced in self-government as the people of the 13 colonies. Their colonial governments were representative and in essence democratic. They became entirely so when the Revolution ended, and the last English governor was withdrawn. In the 4 New England colonies, local government was in the hands of the town meetings, the purest democracies then or now extant. But it is best to remember, what the men of 1787 well knew, that these little democracies moved within fixed bounds determined by the laws of the states under which they had their being. For such a people, of such a character, with such a past and such habits and traditions, only one kind of government was possible, and that was a democracy. The makers of the Constitution called their new government a republic, and they were quite correct in doing so, for it was of necessity republican in form. But they knew that what they were establishing was a democracy. One has but to read the debates to see how constantly present that fact was to their minds. Democracy was then a very new thing in the modern world. As a system it had not been heard of, except in the fevered struggles of the Italian city republics, since the days of Rome and Greece, and although the convention knew perfectly well that they were establishing a democracy, and that it was inevitable that they should do so, some of them regarded it with fear, and all with a deep sense of responsibility and caution. The logical sequence, as exhibited in history, and as accepted by the best minds of the 18th century, struggling to give to men a larger freedom, was democracy, anarchy, despotism. The makers of the Constitution were determined that so far as in them lay the American Republic should never take the second step, never revolve through the vicious circle which had culminated in empire in Rome, in the tyrants of the Grecian and the despots of the Italian cities which in their turn had succumbed to the absolutism of foreign rulers. The vital question was how should this be done? How should they establish a democracy with a strong government? For after their experience of the Confederation they regarded a weak government with horror, and at the same time so arrange the government that it should be safe as well as strong and free from the peril of lapsing into an autocracy on the one hand, or into disorder and anarchy on the other. They did not try to set any barrier in the way of the popular will, but they sought to put effective obstacles in the path to sudden action, which was impelled by popular passion, or popular whim, or by the excitement of the moment. They were the children of the Great Rebellion and the Blessed Revolution in the England of the 17th century, and they were steeped in the doctrine of limiting the power of the king. But here they were dealing with a sovereign who could not be limited, for while a king can be restrained by transferring his power to the people, when the people are sovereign, their powers cannot be transferred to anybody. There is no one to transfer them to. And if they are taken away, the democracy ceases to exist, and another government, fundamentally different, takes its place. The makers of the Constitution not only knew that the will of the people must be supreme, but they meant to make it so. That which they also aimed to do was to make sure that it was the real will of the people which ruled, and not their momentary impulse, their well-considered desire and determination, and not the passion of the hour. The child, perhaps, of excitement and mistake, inflamed by selfish appeals and terrorized by false alarms. The main object, therefore, was to make it certain that there should be abundant time for discussion and consideration, that the public mind should be thoroughly and well informed, and that the movements of the machinery of government should not be so rapid as to cut off due deliberation. With this end in view, they established with the utmost care a representative system with 2 chambers and an executive of large powers, including the right to veto bills. They also made the amendment of the Constitution a process at once slow and difficult, for they intended that it should be both, and indeed that it should be impracticable without a strong, determined, and lasting public sentiment in favor of change. Finally, they established the federal judiciary, and in the Supreme Court of the United States they made an addition to the science of government, second only in importance to their unequaled work in the development of the principle of federation. That great tribunal has become in the eyes of the world the most remarkable among the many remarkable solutions devised by the Convention of 1787 for the settlement of the gravest governmental problems. John Marshall, with the intellect of the jurist and the genius of the statesman, saw the possibilities contained in the words which called the court into being. By his interpretation, and that of his associates and their successors, the Constitution attained to flexibility and escaped the rigidity which then and now is held up as the danger and the defect of a written instrument. In their hands the Constitution has been expanded to meet new conditions and new problems as they have arisen. In their hands also the Constitution has been the protection of the rights of states and of the rights of men, and laws which, in the opinion of the court, violated its principles and provisions have been declared by judicial decision in specific cases to be unconstitutional. By making the 3 branches of the government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, entirely separate and yet coordinate, and by establishing a representative system and creating a Supreme Court of extraordinary powers, the framers of the Constitution believed that they had made democracy not only all-powerful, but at the same time safe, and that they had secured it from the gradual conversion into autocracy on the one hand, and from the destruction by too rapid motion and too quick response to the passions of the moment on the other. If ever men were justified by results, they have been. The Constitution, in its development and throughout our history, has surpassed the hopes of its friends, and utterly disappointed the predictions and the criticisms of its foes. Under it, the United States has grown into the mighty republic we see today. New states have come into the Union, vast territories have been acquired, population and wealth have increased to a degree which has amazed the world, and life, liberty, and property have been guarded beneath the flag which is at once the symbol of the country and of the Constitution under which the nation has risen to its high success. Such results would seem to be a potent argument in favor of the instrument of government through which they have been achieved. But to argue from results seems just now out of fashion. Actual accomplishment, it would appear, is nothing. According to the new dispensation, our decision must be made on what is promised for the future, not on what has been done in the past. Under this novel doctrine, as I have observed it, we are to be guided chiefly by envy and discontent, and are to act on the general principle that whatever is wrong. What then is the plan by which the popular government, which existed under the Constitution for more than a century, and which has been mysteriously lost during the past few years, is to be restored to us? It is proposed, to put it in a few words, to remove all the barriers which the makers of the instrument established in order to prevent rash, hasty, and passionate action, and to secure deliberation, consideration, and due protection for the rights of minorities and of individuals. This is to be accomplished in two ways: by emasculating the representative system through the compulsory initiative and referendum, and by breaking down the courts through the recall. These are the changes by which it is intended to revive popular government. Incidentally, they strike at the very heart of the Constitution as the framers planned and made it. For they will convert the deliberate movement of the government machinery, by which its makers intended to secure to democracy both permanence and success, into an engine which starts at the touch of an electric button, which is as quick in response as a hair-trigger pistol and as rapid in operation as a self-cocking revolver. These new and precious ideas are of a ripe age. In fact, they have passed many hundreds of years beyond the century fixed by Dr. Johnson for the establishment of a literary reputation at a point where it might be intelligently discussed. Let us therefore consider and criticize them. The compulsory initiative and the compulsory referendum need not detain us long, for the effect of those devices is obvious enough. The entire virtue or the entire vice, each of us may use the word he prefers, of these schemes rests in the word compulsory. The initiative, without compulsion, is complete in the rights of petition secured by the first of the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, which really constituted a Bill of Rights. The right of petition became the subject of bitter controversy at a later time, and was vindicated once and for all by John Quincy Adams's great battle in its behalf, more than 3/4 of a century ago. There are few instances where petitions representing a general popular demand have not met a response in action, whether in Congress or in the state legislatures. Still fewer where respectful attention and consideration have not been accorded to them. But the responsibility for action, and the form such action should take, has rested with the representative body. When the initiative is made compulsory, a radical change is effected. A minority, sometimes a small minority, of the voters, always a small minority of the people, can compel the legislature to pass a law and submit it to the voters, even when a very large majority of the people neither ask for nor, as far as the evidence goes, desire it. In this way, all responsibility is taken from the representative body, and they become mere clerks for drafting and recording laws, poor puppets who move mechanically when some irresponsible outsiders twitch the strings. It is a substitution of government by factions and fractions for the government by the people. The representative body as hitherto constituted represented the whole people. Under the new plan, it is to be merely the helpless instrument of a minority, perhaps a very small minority, of the voters. The voluntary referendum has always existed in this country. In the national government, owing to our dual or federal form, the referendum on constitutional amendments is necessarily made to the states, and it has never been suggested for the laws of the United States, owing to both physical and constitutional difficulties. In the states, the referendum has always been freely used, not only for constitutions and constitutional amendments, but for laws, especially for city charters, local franchises, and the like. But if the referendum is made compulsory, on the demand of a minority of the voters, all responsibility vanishes from the representative body. The representative no longer seeks to represent the whole people or even his own constituency, but simply votes to refer everything to the voters, and covers himself completely by pointing to the compulsory referendum. On the other hand, the voters are called upon to legislate. Of the mass of measures submitted they know and can know nothing. Experience shows that in all referendums a large proportion of the voters decline to vote. Whether this is due to indifference or lack of information, the result is the same. It proves that this system demands from the voters what the most intelligent voters in the world are unable to give. They are required to pass upon laws, many of which they have neither time nor opportunity to understand, without deliberation and without any discussion, except what they can gather from the campaign orator, who is, as a rule, interested in other matters, or from an occasional article in a newspaper. They cannot alter or amend. They must vote categorically yes or no. The majority either fails to vote, and the small and interested minority carries its measure, or the majority, in disgust, votes down all measures submitted, good and bad alike, because they do not understand them and will not vote without knowing what their votes mean. The great laws which, both in England and the United States, have been the landmarks of freedom and made ordered liberty possible, were not passed and never could have been perfected and passed in such a way as this. This new plan is spoken of by its advocates as progressive. As a matter of fact, it is the reverse of progressive. It is reactionary. Direct legislation by popular vote was familiar, painfully familiar, to Greece and Rome. In both it led through corruption, violence, and disorder to autocracy and despotism. The direct vote system also proved itself utterly incapable of the government of an extended empire and of large populations. Where government by direct vote miserably failed, representative government, after all deductions have been made, has brilliantly succeeded. The development of the principle and practice of representative government was, as I have already pointed out, the one great contribution of modern times to the science of government. It has shown itself capable of preserving popular government and popular rights without the violence and corruption which resulted of old in anarchy and despotism, and at the same time it has proved its adaptability to the management of large populations and the efficient government of great empires. Representative government was an enormous advance over government by the direct vote of the forum, the agora, or the marketplace, which had preceded it, and which had gone down in disaster. It is now proposed to abandon that great advance and to return to the ancient system with its dark record of disorder and failure. This is not progress. It is retreat and retrogression. It is the abandonment of a great advance, and a return to that which is not only old and outworn, but which history and experience have alike discredited. Look now for a moment at representative government as we ourselves have known it. Let us not forget, in the first place, that the Congress of the United States, under the Constitution, has been in continuous existence for more than 120 years, that with the single exception of the Mother of Parliaments, it is much the oldest representative body of a constitutional character now existing in the world. Let us now remember that the history of the American Congress is in large part the history of the United States, and that we are apt to be proud of that history as a whole and of the many great things we as a people have accomplished. Yet, whatever praise history accords to the Congress of the United States in the past, the Congress of the moment and the members of that body in either branch receive but little commendation from their contemporaries. This is perhaps not unnatural, and it certainly has always been customary. Legislative bodies have rarely touched the popular imagination or appeared in a dramatic or picturesque attitude. The conscript fathers, facing in silence the oncoming barbarians of Gaul, Charles I, attempting to arrest the 5 members, the Continental Congress adopting the Declaration of Independence, the famous oath of the tennis court, are almost the only instances which readily occur to one's mind of representative and legislative bodies upon whom for a brief instant has rested the halo of heroism, and from which comes a strong appeal to the imagination. The men who fight by land and sea rouse immediate popular enthusiasm. But a body of men engaged in legislation does not and cannot offer the fascination or the attraction which are inseparable from the individual man who stands forth alone from the crowd in any great work of life, whether of war or peace. We may accept without complaint this tendency of human nature. But I think every dispassionate student of history, as well as every man who has had a share in the work of legislation, may rightfully deprecate the indiscriminate censure and the consistent belittling which pursue legislative bodies. This attitude of mind is not confined to the United States. The press of England treats its Parliament severely enough, although, on the whole, with more respect than is the case with the American press in regard to the American Congress. But running through English novels and essays we find, as a rule, the same sneer at the representatives of the people as we do here. Very generally, both in this country and abroad, those who write for the public seem to start with the proposition that to be a member of Congress, or a member of Parliament, or a member of the Chamber of Deputies in France, implies some necessary inferiority of mind or character. I do not desire to be rash or violent, but I think this theory deserves a moment's examination, and is, perhaps, open to some doubt. As Mr. Reed, when Speaker of the House, once said, it is a fair inference that a man who can impress himself upon 200,000 people, or upon the whole population of a great state, sufficiently to induce them to send him to the House or Senate, has something more than ordinary qualities and something more than ordinary force. Then again, as Edmund Burke remarked, you cannot draw an indictment against a whole people, nor, I may add, can you draw an indictment against an entire class. There are good men and bad men in business and in the professions, in the ministry, in medicine, in law, and among scholars. Virtue is not determined by occupation. There are, I repeat, good and bad men in every profession and calling, among high and low, rich and poor, and the honest men who mean to do right largely preponderate. For if they did not, the whole social structure would come crashing to the ground. What is true of business and the professions is true of Congress. There are good and bad men in public life, and the proportion of good to bad, I believe, compares favorably with that of any other occupation. Public men live in the fierce light which beats upon them as upon the throne, a light never fiercer or more pitiless than now, and for this reason their shortcomings are made more glaring, and their virtues by contrast more shadowed than in private life. This is as it should be, for the man who does wrong in private life is far less harmful than the public servant who is false to his trust. To inflict upon the public servant who is a wrongdoer the severest reprobation is necessary for the protection of the community, but for this very reason we should be extremely careful that no reprobation should be visited unjustly upon any public man. It is an evil thing to betray the public trust, but it is an equally evil thing to pour wholesale condemnation upon the head of every man in public life, good and bad alike. That which suffers most from an injustice like this in the long run is not the public servant who has been unfairly dealt with, for the individual passes quickly, but the country itself. After all, the voters make the representative. If he is not of the highest type, he appears to be that which the majority prefers. Wholesale criticism and abuse of the representatives reflect more on the constituencies, if we stop to consider, than on those whom the constituencies select to represent them. Indiscriminate condemnation and equally indiscriminate belittling of the men who make and execute our laws, whether in state or nation, is not only a reflection upon the American people, but is a blow to the United States and every state in it. They help the guilty to escape and injure the honest and the innocent. They destroy the people's confidence in their own government and lower the country in the eyes of foreign nations. The Congress of the United States embodies the representative principle. The principle of representation, I repeat, has been the great contribution of the English-speaking race to the science and practice of government. The Greeks and the Romans, let me say once more, had pure democracy in legislation by direct vote in theory, at least, and we have but to read Plato's Republic and the Laws to learn the defects of the system in use in Athens. Greece failed to establish an empire. She touched the highest peaks of civilization, and finally went to pieces politically beneath the onset of Rome. Rome established a great empire, but after years of bloody struggles between the aristocracy and democracy, it ended in a simple despotism. The free cities of Italy oscillated between anarchy and tyranny, only to fall victims in the end to foreign masters. In Florence, they had elections every 3 months and a complication of committee and councils to interpret the popular will. Yet the result was the Medicis and the Habsburgs. It is also to be remembered that the representative principle has been coincident with political liberty. Whatever its shortcomings or defects, and, in all things human, it has its grave defects, it none the less remains true that the first care of every strong man, every savior of society, every man on horseback, of every autocrat, is either to paralyze or to destroy the representative principle. It may be that the representative principle is not the cause of political liberty, but there can be no question whatever that the two have always gone hand in hand, and that the destruction of one has been the signal for the downfall of the other. The Congress of the United States and the legislatures of the several states embody the representative principle. By that principle your laws have been made, and the republican form of government sustained for more than a century. Whatever its shortcomings, it has maintained the government of the United States and upheld law and order throughout our borders. End of section 4.